Welcome to another one-on-one on Talking Feds. I'm really pleased to be, for the first time, I think, on Talking Feds with Preet Bharara, who, as everyone knows, served as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York from 2009 to 2017. At that time, he joined the NYU School of Law faculty as a distinguished scholar in residence. He's also the executive vice president of Some Spider Studios and the host of Cafe's Stay Tuned with Preet, and co-host of Cafe Insider. So you're a storied lawyer, a storied teacher, a storied businessman, storied legislative aide, and journalist.
That's a lot of stories.
It is a lot of stories, and this is your first time here, so we could talk about any of those stops.
Storied Talking Feds guest.
In your fairly stunning career. But actually, to my mind, all those successes have a through line of just thoughtfulness and judgment and sophistication. So I just want to take advantage of our time to ask you about a few pressing issues that are on everyone's mind.
It's good to be with you in the state of Texas.
Yeah, no kidding. All right. Project 2025, you've been focused on of late in some of your commentary. For any DOJ alum, it's somewhat chilling. But what do you see as the sort of stakes there? How serious is it? Why is it something you've really been talking about?
Well, look, I think the evidence that it is a huge problem is in the fact that almost uniquely among policy positions and proposals and approaches by Donald Trump and his team, he has backed away from this, at least publicly. I don't put a lot of stock and weight in his backing away from it because he sees that there's an electoral disadvantage to him, because people are starting to understand what Project 2025 is all about. There are various aspects to it. But I do think the retreat from it tells you all you need to know about how Donald Trump thinks about it. For people like you and me, who grew up in the Department of Justice, the aspects of Project 2025 that are most concerning to us is the taking away of the norm of independence from the Justice Department, the suggestion that everyone can be directed to do whatever political people want in the White House or elsewhere. The idea that normalizing the weaponization of the Justice Department is okay. The idea that career public servants are not to be respected, are not to be protected, is anathema to, I think, the equal and just administration of the laws and of law enforcement. So there's a lot of different things that relate to trade and tax policy and everything else. But I think for people like us who talk about law and order and the rule of law and the Constitution, that's the most problematic part.
It's a really good point. So 900 some pages, but it is the one that has become the showcase. In the first administration, when you served for a short time,
a few weeks, and 7 weeks,
right? But look, actually, those 7 weeks illustrate a little. There is, in some sense, the ultimate power in the White House. You were asked to return a call. You didn't think that was quite right, and you properly, I think, didn't. But then you were, out of a job, as I had been when there was a change in administration. If you try to give some kind of structure to this and put it within a conservative universe of ideas, there's this notion, the unitary executive, and who else would call the shots but the elected president. We've come since, I guess, Watergate to depart from that, but it's really just a matter of sort of norms and culture.
A lot of these things are norms that we take for granted. I think a reasonable, average, thoughtful citizen who is not a lawyer, who is not a criminal prosecutor, who has never spent time steeped in the traditions of the Department of Justice would understand the problem with a regime in which it was okay and encouraged for a sitting president of one party to direct the prosecution of political enemies or direct the dropping of investigations of political allies. Now, there are people who are listening to this, if you have such people in your audience, who are Trump supporters, then on their face, they will say, in fairness to them, well, what are you talking about? Why are you so upset about that? That's happening right now, right? Joe Biden's Justice Department is literally prosecuting Joe Biden's political rival. The difference is...
Although right now you notice there's been a switch. It's a Harris prosecution of everyone, yeah.
It's the Harris Justice Department. Right. And, notwithstanding that glib statement, there is no evidence, zero evidence, in fact, there's evidence to the contrary, that Joe Biden has put his thumb on the scale in any way, shape, or form. The overwhelming evidence suggests, to the consternation of some people on the left who are Democrats, that actually Merrick Garland took his old sweet time to launch an investigation relating to January 6th. That was not his highest priority, and that's why we're stuck in this, fight against the clock in the election,
which we've lost.
Which we've lost. So the evidence shows that Merrick Garland was not really pumped and primed to do that. There's no evidence that Joe Biden had anything to do with it. And by the way, the most amazing piece of evidence that I think proves the point in this context, a different context, that Joe Biden is not putting his thumb on the scales in any way, shape, or form, is he has been allowing his Department of Justice, or the Harris Department of Justice now, full opportunity through a special counsel, David Weiss, to prosecute federally his own son. In no universe could you imagine Donald Trump allowing that to happen. And in a universe in which someone is going to make the accusation that it's a politicized Justice Department, if there were ever an opportunity, given what we know about Joe Biden and his family attachments and his love for his son, who has had issues along the way that we all know about, that would be the place to assert his presidential prerogative. And the fact that he has not done that there puts the lie to the comparison.
Yeah. And by the way, I mean, threw the book at him, I think we have to say, in the latest iteration of the prosecution. Okay. So that puts me in mind of, I agree with you. Of course, I'm often in the position, as you are, in saying, trust me, this is really what it's like in DOJ, and people don't necessarily want to trust you. Early on in the Trump administration, there were many of the people I still knew who really did feel as if the public trust in prosecutors had declined. You didn't have the same kind of wind at your back when you stood up and said Preet Bharara for the United States, maybe even state prosecutors. I wonder what your sense is of the vilification of prosecutors, which I think is a sort of article of faith almost by Donald Trump. Where are we now in sort of public regard for prosecutors?
So I have a bunch of reactions to what you're saying. I think part of the blame is to be laid at the feet of Donald Trump. And the example I would give is a very famous one, is when there came time for there to be a special counsel appointed initially in 2017, after Jim Comey was fired. Donald Trump's own Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, who is a former colleague of ours as well, Rod Rosenstein appointed Bob Mueller. Bob Mueller, at the time of his appointment in 2017, I think it is not an exaggeration to say, was the most revered figure in modern history in law enforcement. Served in the military in Vietnam, had gone to Princeton, was not drafted, signed up, was wounded in the war, served admirably in multiple positions at a high level in the Justice Department, and then served as FBI director, starting just a few days before 9/11, 2001. Then at the conclusion of his 10-year term, when it came time to figure out, who would replace him, in an incredibly polarized Congress with Democrats and Republicans not agreeing on Supreme Court nominees or other high-level nominees or pieces of legislation, even though that I think there are something like 330 million people in the United States, many of whom were qualified for the position and had the requisite experience and expertise and seasoning to be the FBI director. What did we do as a country? Barack Obama is the president, Democratic president, Republican FBI director. They changed the law. They changed the law to extend him for 2 years. An unbelievable bipartisan agreement on the qualifications and neutrality and effectiveness of Robert Mueller. Within months of Robert Mueller, who had that reputation, being appointed the special counsel in the Russia investigation with respect to Donald Trump, the constant swift boating of him by Donald Trump, his allies, his colleagues in the Congress, outside the Congress, on the radio waves on Fox News, served to destroy, in part, in the minds of tens of millions of Americans, Robert Mueller's reputation. And I don't mean to speak for you, but Bob Mueller is a giant compared to the people in this room. And if that could be done to that prosecutor, who, by the way, it's arguable did a favor to Donald Trump, honored his oath, honored the OLC opinion, didn't make a pronouncement about whether or not Donald Trump had committed a crime, there could not have been, at the end of the day, somebody who could have done as thorough a job in a way that would have pleased the sitting president more, ultimately. That's a controversial statement that some people will take that way, but hopefully people understand the spirit in which I say that. And to just go back to the spirit of your question, if you can do that to that guy, you can do it to anybody. I mean, look what's being done to the prosecutor she brought some of this on herself, Fani Willis in Georgia, for a lapse in judgment that has derailed that prosecution for an indefinite period of time. So part of it is that the targets, people like Donald Trump, have a huge bullhorn and will stop at nothing to denigrate the people who are investigating them. Another is some people have made mistakes that adds grist to the mill. I also think it's the case that when there's an investigation that targets someone like a sitting president of the United States or a major party candidate for president of the United States, it's just different. I mean, you and I prosecuted significant people. I've investigated governors, mayors of the city of New York, leaders of the assembly, members of Congress. And yeah, there are always people who are like, it's a witch hunt. Those people always say that. And they have allies who claim it's political or not. But generally speaking, even when it's someone as substantial as a governor, Martha Stewart was prosecuted by my predecessor, Jim Comey, one of our former colleagues. Yeah, there's some controversy. But people ultimately, I think, by a large majority, respect the prosecution, respect the investigation. If there's a conviction by a jury of one's peers, they sort of accept that. Not everyone will, but generally speaking, they do. I do think that given how polarized we are and how significant the position of president or major party candidate for president is as compared to a governor or senator, it distorts the hell out of everyone's thinking and it makes people crazy. Whether it's Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or Joe Biden, I think our system, as well structured as it is, as sort of fine the traditions are of our Justice Department, it's just not built to handle the inherent conflicts, issues, suspicions, skepticism that tens of millions of people who are devoted to one candidate or the other will have about the process. That's not a solution.
You can't respond in the public in the same way.
I just think people who are devotees of one of those people, if you think Donald Trump is the second coming, he can do no wrong, right? And if you think Hillary Clinton, because Donald Trump tells you so, is a crooked felon who's running free, then you chant lock her up. It's an unfortunate development. I like to think it's most distorted only at the level of when the target is that prominent, is either the most powerful person in the country or on the cusp of potentially being the most powerful person in the country. And that distortion and the denigration of prosecutors doesn't happen as much in not just garden variety cases, but other significant cases, just ones that are not as prominent as those. What do you think about it?
Yeah. Well, I do think that there's been a difference, and I think I might mildly disagree. In other words, I do think that some of the corrosive effect has actually extended to garden variety federal prosecutions where it's just not the case that
trickle
the
down.
DOJ is the good guy
trickle
necessarily.
Down effect.
Actually, let me ask you a quick question, but a hard question.
I didn't sign up for hard questions.
Right, let me ask you a quick
medium,
question.
Have a medium
hard.
Yeah.
You mentioned Merrick Garland in the context in which he's been mentioned so much these last couple of years, how quick was the prosecution, et cetera. I think arguably he took as his main mission coming in a kind of Ed Levy mission of rebalancing the department, having there be no question within and without of its integrity and the like. Probably it's likely that his tenure is coming to an end. How do you think on that primary mission? Do you think mission accomplished?
I think he's done a very good job. I'm going to stick with my point. I think any attorney general who has to navigate the potential investigation and prosecution of a sitting president or a former president who has half the country on his side is bound to get beat up and is bound to be viewed poorly by half the population. And by the way, by a significant percentage of the other half of the population who's upset that you weren't aggressive enough. I mean, you and I both faced in much, I'm imagining, I mean to speak for you, in much, much milder ways. You can't win, right? Like
But people can believe you're straight.
Right. Simultaneously accused of being too aggressive and not aggressive enough. I got that all the time, right? Why'd you arrest that guy? Too aggressive. Why didn't you arrest that guy? Not aggressive enough. You call them like you see them. So I think inherently the job of attorney general is incredibly difficult. To get everyone to have faith and confidence in the integrity of the Justice Department is just difficult because people mistrust institutions generally. It's true of the Supreme Court. It's true of the Fourth Estate. It's also true of the executive branch and the Department of Justice because, in part, a lot of lies are being told. In part, a lot of people are engaged in scorched earth and bad faith defense. It's also difficult. Now, on the question of...
All that's true, but I think it was aggravated or maybe even went to a new level in the last, in the
Yeah.
first Trump administration.
But, on the question of should Merrick Garland have moved quicker or not?
Oh, that wasn't the question.
Well, it's related. It's related. I'm increasing the level of difficulty, I think, from medium to hard. The way I think about it is Merrick Garland, incredibly well-intentioned, incredibly steady hand when he came in. And the last thing on his mind was, given all the contentiousness of the prior 4 years and the polarization and everything else, and the faith that was eroding, some of it intentionally so, on the part of the people towards the Justice Department, was something he wanted to get past, as you mentioned. And there are FBI agents and other authorities already investigating hundreds of people who were responsible for the insurrection or involved in the insurrection, riots, whatever you want to call them, of January 6th. So that was being handled, right? And the idea that you come in at the beginning of the Biden term and the first thing you're going to do is convene a meeting with Lisa Monaco, the Deputy Attorney General, and others, how are we going to, open an investigation to the president, the former president? It is totally understandable why you wouldn't do that. But then a month goes by, another month goes by, and probably at the time, given the information they had, because they hadn't done an investigation, it's not that plausible that you would find particular statutes that you could prove all the elements of beyond a reasonable doubt against the former president of the United States. That's also sort of understandable. The problem is, notwithstanding, I think, the good faith sentiment and the desire not to be looking like you're prosecuting a rival of your president and sort of, put the department on an even keel, months go by, and then another thing happens. So the January 6th committee gets formed in the United States Congress, and they start doing some of the investigating that the department, for reasons that we've just talked about, probably was not keen to be doing. And they start uncovering stuff that got ahead of the department. And it's been reported widely, after speculation I think people like you and I have had for a long time before the reporting, the January 6th committee forced the Justice Department's hand. They were starting to uncover evidence that now looked like it could plausibly sustain an allegation of a violation of particular statutes. And so they were behind the curve on that. There were months, if not, a year or a year and a half behind on that. And then suddenly, the department looks like it's pivoting to prosecuting the person that was not the top priority because they didn't want to look political. And so it's understandable how we got to this point. But I think at this point, no one is satisfied with it.
So I hear you, and I just want to put in a marker so as not to get a total detour that I think it's not entirely clear that they were behind as much as you say, that there was nothing going on during that time.
No, there's nothing, but there are dozens of witnesses, this we know for a fact, dozens of witnesses that the January 6th committee talked to that the department did not talk to. And as you and I also know, that not at this level of stakes, but it is often the case that the Department of Justice asks the Congress to hold back so that they're not creating duplicative testimony. That's prosecution 101. Congress doesn't always, listen. They don't always abide by the request or yield to the request. But it happens a lot. Here, the department, maybe they were doing some things, and there's some reports about that, and I don't deny that. But, the basic shoe leather investigative work of interviewing, percipient witnesses were brought before the January 6th committee long before they were brought before the department.
Yeah. Although the January 6th committee could go right to the richer targets that wouldn't have been the very first. But I take all that. I really hope you'll come back and talk about the Supreme Court, but I know we don't have that much time. I just wanted to ask you about a current issue that I think is very interesting for people. I saw you on an interview predicting, as I might have as well, that on the 11th Circuit appeal, Jack Smith would say recuse, and he didn't. Also, just earlier this week, Mayor Chan in New York put over the sentence and made the sentencing of Trump and made a kind of big deal that the prosecution hadn't, in a similar way, had been kind of passive and just served it up. I just wonder what you think about those prosecutorial decisions, if they surprised you, and whether that's somehow in keeping with a button-down prosecutor's role to actually, step back and be so passive about these issues.
I think on those two particular ones, I think the prosecutors could have gone either way. I think on the question of the timing of the sentencing, for various reasons, maybe not trying to look like they have too much bloodlust in the Manhattan DA's office, they have not been particularly pressing and impatient about the sentencing. They have the conviction, 34 counts. None of the other cases are going forward anytime soon. I think, the victory for accountability is the conviction. I think also when you combine that with the likelihood, I'm sure that's in the head of Alvin Bragg and his colleagues, not everyone loves this fact, and I don't know what you've said about this, the likelihood that Trump is going to get anything like a prison sentence at sentencing is very low, given his age, given the nature of the charges, given the lack of prior convictions. So at the end of the day, it's not a case like we sometimes see where you have a defendant who needs to be held accountable is convicted, and then, boy, it's needed to get that person off the streets right away, to stop them in their tracks, or to get them serving their sentence.
I mean, that won't happen anyway because there'll be an appeal. Even if he's got a short-term incarceration,
there's no rush here, right? Because he'll be, I think, almost everyone agrees that even at the sentencing proceeding, even if there's a 3-month or a 4-month or whatever sentence imposed, it's not going to be served anytime soon. And now we're getting closer to the election. People are not being so explicit about it other than the Trump team. I think probably it was a good discretionary move. I don't know what you think. I'm curious to know what you think. That they're like, why should we look like we're in a rush to send this guy to jail? We proved our point with accountability. Jail won't be coming anytime soon anyway, even if it is imposed. So we defer to the judge. They didn't oppose it. They didn't support it. They sort of took no position, which is sometimes we think it's a mealy-mouthed way to be if you're the government, but I understand it in this instance. Do you?
Well, just quickly, then I'll say no. And well, I think, in fact, it wasn't a matter of seeming in a rush. Their North Star had been, Merchants also had been, we'll just go one step in front of another.
We pretend he's like anybody else.
But Well, that's a whole nother podcast, right? Though, to what extent the factors you're adverting to now should actually factor in. But they had the whole, Judge Chutkan just the day before says, I don't see a presidential election. I'll just say one more thing, which is I do think it mattered, right? I think this would have been a way to, stiffen his spine, to follow through with what his general impulse to date, and he felt a little bit lonely, I think.
It's just an odd construct that you and I articulate all the time. And I've come to think differently about it. We say no one's above the law. We say treat the law, everyone has to be treated equally. We say democracy is the most important thing. Someone's not the president anymore. He's an ordinary citizen like Harry Littman or Preet Bharara. Yeah, that's sort of true. But it is also the case that we say a sitting president can't be prosecuted. There's two OLC opinions to that effect. That's not treating him the same, even so. And Judge Chutkan in D.C. you mentioned, who says, I'm not going to pay attention to the election, everyone's the same. Literally the question that she's analyzing and has to, cogitate over is the Supreme Court decision, which is literally about the identity of this particular defendant and his former status as president of the United States of America, right? So to the extent we're saying glibly, well, it doesn't matter who someone is, everyone's the same. He's not the same. The Supreme Court decision about immunity, which I'm sure we both disagree with in large parts, is applicable to, by my count, 5 human beings in the world, right? 5 former presidents of the United States, and no one else. So we have to be, I think, a little bit more sophisticated about this idea that everyone's the same. Donald Trump is not the same. If it's possible in the circumstances to treat him as the same, maybe you can do that. There were all these debates when he got arrested the first time. Does he get his fingerprints done? Does he get a mugshot? These are all questions of first impression, but it's a little bit naive, and I think I subjected myself to this criticism as well, to say he's not like everyone else, and the Supreme Court says the same.
Tremendously interesting point. We have to end here. I will just say, look, there is another whole vision for what could have happened here, more like Nixon, where philosopher kings say, the best just resolution for all of society would be something like, you don't go to jail, but you go away. But instead, because of, in fact, the political polarization, the system committed to trying to treat him the same. So this did represent a kind of blink to what had been the aspiration. But fair enough. Preet Bharara, really fun to talk to you about all this stuff. Hope you'll come back.
A lot of fun.
And I admire your work quite a bit.
Let the record reflect that we are shaking hands.
Okay. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.